Lecture 7, The Changing Face of Zionist Colonization.
In the last lecture, I discussed how Zionist immigration into Palestine began with the first Aliyah. The first Aliyah, I also said, can be interpreted in one of two ways. One of those ways is as a dead end. Another way as a precursor to subsequent waves of immigration that could only have occurred had the path already been set for them. For example, the first Aliyah determined that the plantation system could not work. None of the subsequent Aliyot attempted to do that. What I want to do in this lecture is to look at the next three waves of immigration into Palestine, the second, third, and fourth Aliyot. Let me begin by reading a quotation from a book called Frontiers of Hope that was published in 1929 by Horace M. Callan, describing his trip to Palestine in 1929. Here is a passage in which he's discussing the nature of the new immigrants that had arrived both in the immediate pre-World War I period and in the immediate post-World War I period. The pioneer is naturally a laborite and a doctrinaire socialist. He is a pacifist with the passions of the greatest war in his past. He is passionate about education. He has the modernist preoccupation with the arts as special branches of life. He seeks in Palestine no simple personal salvation, nor even the healing of the children of Israel. His aspiration is the prophetic one. He believes in the mission of Israel and in Jewry's duty and destiny to be a light unto the nations. His kibbutzim and his moshavot, his labor organization, and his cooperative societies are endeavors to kindle that light. His vision of a future counterweighs the Orthodox Judaists' security of the past. His experiment, with all their grime and negligence, had the spark of life in them. They more than offset the black and unhappy repetitions that wring the heart here and there in the shining Palestinian countryside. Obviously, Callan's view of what was taking place in Palestine with the second and third Aliyot is a bit mythologized, and yet it does point us in a direction where we can see the difference between the second and third Aliyot and the first Aliyah. Although the first wave of immigration failed to provide viable economic and social structures for Jewish colonization efforts, these structures were created during the second and third Aliyot. The second Aliyah took place from 1904 until 1914. It was interrupted, of course, by the First World War, and then a new wave of immigration began at the conclusion of the First World War, a wave that is usually dated from 1918 to 1923. These two waves of immigration brought approximately 75,000 new settlers to Palestine. Now, both the second and third Aliyot were sparked by events that took place in Europe. We can trace them both back to the Russian Revolution of 1905, after which there was a large wave of anti-Semitism that spread throughout Russia, and the Kishinev pogrom that had taken place earlier that we spoke about in the last lecture. These two events gave rise to the Aliyot that took place after the first Aliyah, and they also tend to color the nature of the immigration, the ideas of the immigrants, and the geographic locale from whence they came. For example, most of the immigrants came from Russia, although the third Aliyah was a bit more diverse than the second one, including individuals from Lithuania, Galicia, and Poland. A majority of the immigrants were young and unmarried. and most spoke Yiddish, but with a smattering of Hebrew. There are three aspects of the second and third aliyot that are of particular importance. First, the immigrants of the second aliyah, and to a slightly lesser extent, immigrants on the third aliyah, might be said to form the aristocracy of Israeli society. Until the 1970s, for example, every prime minister of Israel came from their ranks. The leadership of the military, the leadership of other branches of the government also came from the ranks of the second and third aliyot. The second thing that's important about the second and third aliyot is that the immigrants were united around a political program. The political program consisted of two core elements. The first one was called the conquest of land, and the second one was called the conquest of labor. Now, the conquest of land is probably the more simple of the two concepts to understand. Very simply put, Zionists would spread colonies throughout Palestine and tame the land of Palestine. They would bring the land under cultivation, drain the swamps, and in the words that are often cited, make the desert bloom. In this way, Zionist settlers would make a permanent imprint on the land. They would change the nature of the land. One prominent Zionist of the period put it as follows: before the coming of the first Jewish pioneers to Palestine, wells and springs had been allowed to dry up. The land had been denuded of trees. Nothing prevented the sand dunes from encroaching. Only malarial swamps flourished in that once fruitful country. To this desolation came the pioneers. They drained swamps, built roads, removed stones and rocks from the good earth. They sowed and they reaped, fought disease and hostile neighbors, established a new homeland for themselves and their children. Now, Zionists, of course, did not invent the idea of conquest of land at this time, nor were they the only ones involved in a conquest of the land movement in Palestine. Now, it's probable that the Zionists borrowed much of their ideology from the surrounding culture, particularly from land colonization efforts that were being initiated in Prussia. The Germans, or many people who considered themselves ethnically German, felt that the East Prussian population would have to reflect German culture, German ethnicity. And what that meant, of course, was tilting the balance of East Prussia, of the population, from Poles to Germans. The way that they would go about doing this would be through something called the Artemenon movement, which the German government encouraged. The Artemenon movement was a back-to-the-land movement, which was complete with a built-in nationalist ideology. In this case, it was German nationalism that was so strong. So this is one of the ways that the Zionists got their ideas from. And also, as cultural historians, what we can see is that these ideas were pervasive in 19th century Europe. And this, of course, was a period in time in which many of these people were born, many of these people came of age, etc., etc. And so therefore, what we can do is we can look at Palestine itself and see if there were other movements involved as well in Palestine that were involved in a back-to-the-land movement, a conquest of land movement. And sure enough, we find them as well in Palestine. We have, for example, already alluded to the efforts of German Protestants who came to Palestine to build agricultural colonies. These were the so-called Templars, who, as I said several lectures ago, took their name from the medieval crusading order. So much for the conquest of land. the idea of the conquest of labor is a little bit more complex. In part, the idea of the conquest of labor was derived from another central Zionist idea called the negation of exile. According to many Zionists, the experience of the diaspora had made Jews incapable of being a real nation. According to David Ben-Gurion, for example, and Ben-Gurion would go on to become the first prime minister of the new state of Israel, the diaspora means dependence, material, political, cultural, and intellectual dependence, because we are aliens, a minority, bereft of a homeland, rootless and separated from the soil, from labor, and from basic industry. Our task is to break radically with this dependence and become masters of our own fate. In a word, to achieve independence. Now, what Ben-Gurion was referring to, of course, was an idea that Jews would have to emerge from petty trade and fill all the essential jobs in an economy in order for them to establish themselves as a true nation. Now, while the conquest of labor idea might be traced to other European ideas, such as utopian socialism and romanticism, there was another reason why it became a predominant part of the ideology of the second and third aliyot. As I stated last time, intentions of colonizers provide only one foundation for what they really end up doing. The other foundation comes from an interaction that these colonizers have with the indigenous population, the colonized, the people upon whom they, or with whom they build their settlements. One Israeli sociologist, who's actually a colleague of mine now at the University of California, San Diego, Gershon Shafir, has written that there was a practical reason as well for the ideology of the conquest of labor. According to Shafir, the concept of the conquest of labor was driven by the fact that the Jewish settlers could not allow Arab labor on the market for two reasons. First, if Arabs were allowed to participate in a common labor market, this would increase the pool of labor and would drive down wages. If wages were too low, no new settlers would want to come to Palestine. That's the first reason why conquest of labor was had practical roots. The second reason was that European Jewish immigrants could not compete with Arabs on the labor market under any circumstances, simply because they were used to a higher standard of living. In other words, if Jewish employers were faced with the idea of employing either Arabs or Jews, Arabs, since they had a lower standard of living, would work cheaper, and of course it would close the Jews out of the Jewish labor market. Now, institutions were organized by the Jews of Palestine to correspond with their three core ideas: conquest of labor, conquest of land, and the third one, which is part of or contributing towards the conquest of labor, the negation of exile. The institutions that were organized by the second and third aliyot gave a distinctive tinge to Jewish society in Palestine. Now, let me introduce another word, which I'm going to be using from here until 1948-49. That word is yeshuv. When I refer to yeshuv, what I mean is the Jewish population of Palestine. The yeshuv, by the way, includes Zionists who immigrated to Palestine, and the Jews who had been living in Palestine anyway, and also Jews who came to Palestine with no real Zionist credentials, no real commitment to a Zionist movement. Now, many of the institutions that were established in the Yeshuv were similar to institutions that exist to this very day. And this is a major contribution of the second and third Aliyot. For example, Hebrew was established as the lingua franca. In part, this was to differentiate the community of Palestine from that of diaspora. In part, of course, it was to differentiate the community of Palestine, the Jewish community of Palestine, from their Arab neighbors. The settlers organized a labor federation in 1920 called the Histadrut. The Histadrut had a purpose which was to ensure that there would be some sort of development of infrastructure, such as healthcare, education, etc., that would be worker-friendly. To this very day, the Histadrut has a major part in Israeli society of supporting welfare projects and social services, and therefore should be seen as something more than what Americans consider to be a labor federation. It does far more than, let's say, the AFL does in the United States. Workers in Palestine organized themselves into two main political parties during the second and third Aliyot. And the traces of those two parties are still with us today. One of those parties was called Poal Zion. It was a very ideological party which drew its ideas from both socialism and Zionism. That was the first party. And the second party is Hapoel Hatzair. Now, there was much common ground between these two parties. Both were committed to the conquest of labor ideas, of course, because this is where the constituency came from. And both were committed to the fostering of a new Hebrew culture. The two parties thus united in 1930 to form the Mapai Party, the Labor Party of Israel. The Mapai became the dominant grouping in the World Zionist Organization in 1933. Finally, new types of agricultural settlements were established during the second and third Aliyot. Now, plantations still remained an important mode of production until World War I. But these new forms of settlements gradually took the place of the failing plantation system. These new settlements were very different from the plantations, as opposed to, for example, a monoculture growing grapes. These settlements employed a model of mixed farmings. They thus integrated the cultivation of fruits and vegetables with animal husbandry, dairy farming, everything that each individual settlement would need. Now, the most novel of these new settlements was the kibbutz, whose role in the Israeli mythos is virtually identical with the role in American mythology of the cowboy. Not too many Americans were cowboys, but yet we all feel that this is intrinsically us. Not too many Israelis were residents of kibbutzim, and yet Israelis feel that this is what we authentically are, kibbutzim. Kibbutzim were communal farms. They were established for the first time in around 1909 or 1910 in Degania, and served a very important purpose. According, once again, to Shafir, the kibbutz movement had started as a means to bypass the threat of Arab labor, but became ideological by the third Aliyah. Overall, then, the fact that Israel became a Hebrew-speaking sort of social democracy whose economic development followed a path separate from that of the indigenous population can be attributed to these two waves of immigration. Once again, to emphasize, these two waves of immigration were the waves of immigration that attempted and I want to underline the word attempted because it didn't succeed, but attempted to create completely independent economic and social structures from the economic and social structures of the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. These two waves of immigration also, as I said, form a very important part of the Israeli myth, the pioneer myth, the intrepid pioneer against the savage land and the savage people that inhabit that savage land. But the story of Israeli society would be incomplete without acknowledging the role played by the next wave of immigration, the fourth Aliyah, whose contribution to Israeli society presents a very important counterpart to its immediate predecessors. You'll understand in a minute exactly why it is that the Zionist mythology, particularly the mythology that we tend to hear quite a bit in the United States, that this mythology tends to underplay the fourth Aliyah and play up the role of the second and third. The fourth Aliyah was very big. It brought about 82,000 new immigrants to Palestine during the years 1924 to 1932. It was significantly different, however, from the previous two Aliyot in four ways. First of all, about half of the new immigrants, the immigrants of the fourth Aliyah, came from Poland in the wake of anti-Jewish legislation that had been passed there. Secondly, most of these people who came with the fourth Aliyah were not the young, idealistic, middle-class student types who advocated a combination of hippie mythos with a strong dose of socialism. Most of these were established small traders, middlemen, the petty bourgeoisie from Warsaw and the city of Łódź. Most did not subscribe to the same conquest of labor and the conquest of land ideology that the previous two waves of immigrants did advocate. In fact, a majority did not feel that their life purpose was to look at the tail end of a cow while plowing a field. Most settled, about 4/5, settled in Tel Aviv and Haifa and other coastal cities, not in rural areas. This, of course, created a great demographic change in the coastal cities. From 1923 through 26, for example, the population of Tel Aviv expanded from 16,000 to 40,000. Finally, most of the people who came in the fourth Aliyah were not ideologically inspired. Most were more akin to refugees than they were to young, idealistic ideologues. Now, many of these refugees found their spokesman in Vladimir Jabotinsky, who founded what has become known as the revisionist movement, revisionist Zionism. The name revisionism implies, of course, something had gone wrong and has to be revised. The name revisionism as used here means that Jabotinsky and his followers felt that with the dominance of labor Zionism, what I had just described in the second and third Aliyot, and as I said, by the early 1930s, that this tendency had taken control of the World Zionist Organization. With the dominance of this ideology, Zionism had taken fundamentally a wrong turn. It was therefore necessary to revise the Zionist movement for, quote, the gradual transformation of Palestine, and I'll get into what they mean by Palestine in a moment, into a self-governing commonwealth under the auspices of an established Jewish majority. Now, these words were written after Palestine was divided into two parts by the British. The area that we now refer to as Palestine, and we will refer to this area as Palestine, meaning the whole area between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. We will continue to refer to that until 1948. That area was severed from the area across the Jordan, Transjordan. In other words, the country that is now Jordan and the country that is now Israel and the occupied territories were once considered part of Palestine, and the revisionists wanted once again to open up Transjordan for Jewish immigration. Now, according to Jabotinsky, the program of the revisionists was not particularly complicated. Quote, "The aim of Zionism is a Jewish state. The system, mass colonization. The solution of the financial problem, a national loan. These principles cannot be realized without international sanction. Hence the commandment of the hour, a new political campaign and the militarization of Jewish youth in Eretz Israel and the Jewish diaspora." Let me explain this word militarization of Jewish youth in Eretz Israel. Like the labor Zionist, Jabotinsky was very much influenced by his cultural milieu. His cultural milieu, however, was a different cultural milieu than that which gave rise to labor Zionism. No longer was there fluffy liberalism, no longer was there utopian socialism. Now Jabotinsky was growing up in a world that was heavily influenced by the nationalist movements that were arising during the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War, and also other movements as well. Futurism, Italian socialism, and yes, Italian fascism as well. Hence his call for the militarization of Jewish youth. He abandoned ideas such as class struggle and the nationalization of the means of production. Thus, support for the movement came from, as I said, the petty bourgeoisie, many of whose youth joined an organization called Betar, which was founded in Riga. Unlike labor Zionists, who projected themselves as the elite of Zionism, the revisionist movement was non-elite, non-elitist. It was, in other words, populist. Now, why is this fourth aliyah important? Well, there are a number of reasons. It's not just because, well, you can't get to the fifth aliyah without going through the fourth. The fourth aliyah, first of all, represents a different source for contemporary Israeli political thought than that which is represented by the second and third aliyot. Just as the Mapai party came from the political parties that were formed during the second and third aliyot, the main rival of the Mapai, the Likud party, is a direct descendant of the political ideas of the fourth aliyah. The first Likud prime minister, Menachem Begin, took power in 1977. The current Israeli prime minister, Ariel Sharon, is a member of the Likud. The second reason why this aliyah is very important is that the thought of Vladimir Jabotinsky was extremely state-centered. He felt that the only way to unite the Jews of the Yeshuv was through the agency of a powerful state. Now, although Ben-Gurion was his political opponent, he too, at the point of independence, felt that it would have to rely on the state. He would have to rely on the state for the unification of all these various aliyot, all these various groupings within Palestinian society. So therefore, like Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion made Israeli society extraordinarily state-centric, promoting a doctrine called mamlachtiyot. We'll talk more about this in our lecture when we talk about the first years of independence.